It's mid-September, and here in the West, the trout fishing is about to go crazy for the next 8 weeks or so, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to you by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at 140 plus stores nationwide or at sportsmans.com. They will ship direct to store. Also, for you Northern Colorado thinkers, don't forget about Peterson Toyota. For all your Toyota needs, get yourself a Tundra or a Tacoma like me here in Fort Collins, Colorado. So, mid-September at this point, and I'm packing up yet again. Yes, this time of year I pack a lot. I pack and unpack all day, every day. I'm packing up yet again. This time we're gearing up for a couple days of trout fishing, and I'm not going to lie, this is some of my favorite fishing of the year. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a bass guy first and foremost when it comes to freshwater fishing. I like bass the best, but I like a lot of fish, and this time of year is when I really like to fish for trout, and we'll make a considerable effort to do it. We'll put some serious miles on the Tundra to do it, and I'll do it with the Big Ranger boat. We'll also do it out of the little boat, my little 12-foot Coleman crawdad. We'll also do it from the banks, and I will trout fish in rivers and also prairie pothole stuff, and that's really what I wanted to talk more about right now. Is some of the lakes, and there's shallow weedy lakes all over the western United States. There's a bunch of them in Colorado, in North Park, Middle Park, and South Park. There's a bunch of them in southern Wyoming. I know of several of them in Utah, and I'm sure they're all over Montana, whatever. Maybe they're reclaimed gravel quarries, whatever they are, but there's a lot of shallow weedy lakes with trout in them, and they grow like crazy. Besides that, there's almost an infinite number of reservoirs around the West where, again, the trout fishing is going to get really good over the next little bit. And it really has to do with the water cooling down. As the water cools down, their metabolism gets going and they start getting fired up. Some of it has to do with the fact that brown trout are fall spawners, as are brook trout. And so they'll start coming to their spawning cycle here as we get a little closer into October. I guarantee already staging up in various places around the West as they start thinking about it and starting to get some color on them as well. And I'll know a little bit more about that in the next few days. But if you're listening to this podcast on Friday when it's supposed to be published, I will be in the boat at that point chasing some of these trout. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that at this time of year, hyperphagia is a thing. So yeah, some of them are thinking about spawning. Some of them are generally just cooling down and getting giddy. But they're all thinking about the fact that winter's coming and it's time to eat and stack on weight. Same as bears and deer and everybody else. Everybody wants to eat more this time of year. The term is hyperphagia. Myself included, have been doing a bunch of cooking. So let's talk about addressing trout this time of year, because I tend to be very aggressive about how I address trout in September, October, and early November. And for the record, before I get too far into that, it will get better and better and better all the way up till ice in most cases. And most of the lakes and reservoirs that I fish, right up until you can't fish anymore, it's just going to get better and better. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. So if you're getting this, you say, well, I can't go fishing for a couple, 3 weeks. Well, that's fine. You're going to just get better than what I'm telling you about right now. In fact, right now can be a little bit tricky as you get fish spread out in the water column. They're not in their summer areas. They're not necessarily completely stacked in their fall areas yet. So, but it's very close, and that's why we're doing this podcast now. So a couple things. First of all, I address brown trout and rainbow trout differently. And a lot of people don't make distinctions there, but I do. And the reason I do is that I find that I can fish in most cases more aggressively for the brown trout than I can for the rainbow trout this time of year. And what I mean by that is I can fish bigger baits, faster baits, more erratic baits. I can move my boat around more. I can just cover water more aggressively in general. And I think that probably has to do with their spawning phase more than anything else. And I'm not an advocate of fishing for spawning trout in a lot of cases, or spawning fish in general. I think it takes a lot of the sport out of it, so to speak. And that includes bed fishing for bass, and guys do it, and I've done it. I've done a ton of it myself, which is why I can say unequivocally that a bass on a bed is easier to catch if for no other reason he'll sit there and let you keep casting to him. Same thing with a trout. So I'm not advocating fishing trout on their beds, or reds as people like to call them. I am going to fish pre-spawners and post-spawners, and that means I'll catch them coming and going to their spawning areas more than their actual spawning areas themselves. So I want to throw that preface out there. The other thing I'll throw out, though, that's almost equally important is I have had a lot of talks with a lot of biologists over the years. For years, Colorado Parks and Wildlife was a sponsor of mine. I have spent 15, 20 years in boats with biologists. They assure me that basically none of the trout in any of the lakes and reservoirs around Colorado anyway are going to spawn naturally. They're going to go through the motions. You're going to see them doing it, but their recruitment levels are so low that if it wasn't for the stocking programs, they wouldn't be there at all. And so if you are, and I'm not trying to justify fishing for spawning trout, I'm not. What I'm trying to justify, or what I'm trying to explain, is that it is not going to hurt to pester them somewhere around their spawning phase, because they're not going to be effective anyway. And even in places like in North Park, Colorado, where one of the lakes that I fish commonly is a brood lake, meaning that Parks and Wildlife uses it to stock all the rest of the lakes around the state, there you'll see heavy amounts of spawning activity in that lake, but the biologist that manages it assures me that it is completely ineffective. There's not enough running water to make those eggs be viable, so they have to catch them in fish traps, and then they will get milk from the males and eggs from the females. They will mix them, they will ship them off to a hatchery, and then those will be restocked back, including the lake they came out of in the first place, with a much higher success rate than if they were left on their own accord. So don't feel horrible about that, although I still tend to leave them alone, like I said, more for the sporting standpoint than anything else. So again, back to the browns versus the rainbows. The rainbows I fish more subtly in general this time of year. So a classic example of that would be I fish them deeper, I fish them slower, and I fish them with more innocuous lures, with less rattles, less vibration, things like that. So if you're thinking jig, you're right on the money. I'm thinking when it comes to rainbows in the fall, I am more often thinking jigs than anything else. Tube jigs, gulp minnows, little swim jigs of some sort, gulp paddle shads. There's all different kinds of baits that you can throw for rainbow trout, even marabou jigs, very, very effective. But I generally do better with jigs than I do anything else for rainbow trout this time of year. I fish them very tight to the bottom. I'll fish them on inside and outside weed lines, or right along the tops of the weeds themselves, to where I just tick the weeds with the jig. In this case, it's typically all about the subtle bite, meaning that a lot of times they'll take an aggressive snap to get their attention, but it's as the bait settles all the way back down to the bottom. You've got to wait that little bit of extra time, a lot of the times with rainbows this time of year. Meaning, if let's say it's summer, I snap that 3-inch gulp minnow up off the bottom, and it'll get smoked halfway back to the bottom. A lot of the time, when you're talking about fall, they won't get it till it's all the way back in the bottom. And I think it has to do, and it's a little bit conjecture here, but I think it has to do with the fact that they're feeding heavily on brown trout eggs. As brown trouts are making their spawn cycle, or going through their spawn cycle, the females will drop some eggs and the rainbows will eat them. I think that has a lot to do with it, but I can't swear to that. I just know that the rainbows tend to feed down, and if I want to target rainbows, then I will focus on them with jigs. Conversely, if I want to target the browns, let's say that assuming they're both in the same fishery, then I will almost always start on browns with a hard bait of some sort, a long skinny hard bait typically being my preference. So in the old days, when I was a younger angler, we would throw floating Rapalas at them, and we did really good. As time went on, lures have gotten better, lures have gotten more consistent and all that. I mixed up over time. I've gone to a whole mix of different jerk baits that are more consistent, and these days the hit stick has done a lot of the heavy lifting for me. It's a Berkeley bait, it's a slow floater, and it works very well. Typically, if I'm going to pick a hit stick or any jerkbait for that matter, for brown trout, it's going to be somewhere between 9 centimeters and 13 centimeters. Now, real quickly, that's going to raise some eyebrows if you know how big a 9 centimeter bait is. A lot of people, in my experience, are throwing much smaller baits, and that's fine. You will get bites with them, but this is the time of year that I'm looking for bigger bites. For one, I'm looking to provoke the aggressiveness of the brown trout. For two, and the big bait will do that. And it may be even that I'm appealing to their territorialness. There's just not really a key example of why they're biting it, but I know that it could be territorial, it could be pure aggression. It's not likely an eating thing, although it could be an eating thing as well. But I really feel like that more often than not, I'm just going to provoke them into biting. And I've seen scenarios where they want that jerkbait going real fast, meaning just jerk, 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 jerk. And it's almost like an attack mode. I've seen others where they will very commonly, you'll jerk it a bunch of times and you'll get follows. And when you kill it and just let it sit there and it will slowly rise to the surface, that's when they'll get it. I've also seen scenarios where they won't get it till it breaks the surface film. As it floats up and it breaks the surface film, that's when they'll actually get it. But that concept of provoking them rather than feeding them is really important. And so you're really trying to irritate them into biting when it comes to the brown trout, whereas the rainbow trout, we're actually just feeding them. Now, somebody's going to point out, well, I threw a hard plug and I caught rainbows. Of course, not all fish are going to do everything the same. But I can tell you that, and I mentioned this in other podcasts, we did a whole TV show one time because I got into a discussion with a biologist who did not feel that I could target rainbows or browns specifically in a lake that had both. And we proved that biologist fundamentally wrong by throwing jigs and catching rainbows almost 100% exclusively. We caught like 90% rainbows on jigs, and we threw hard plugs and caught 90% browns on hard plugs the same day, in the same boat, on the same lake, in the same spots. That doesn't mean we threw them to the same spots, although we tried to mix up our casts such that we were getting the best intel based on the baits themselves. What I mean by we didn't throw them to the same spots, a lot of the hard plugs we were throwing up shallower and working them back to deep water, or we were throwing them parallel with the bank and working them across a specific contour line. Conversely, with the jigs, a lot of those we were throwing out around deeper water, never landing them quite as shallow in the first place, or working them almost purely vertical if the boat was in a little bit deeper water. But at the end of the day, with two guys, one throwing a hard bait, one throwing a jig, and then mixing back and forth, we were very clearly able to demonstrate the differences in behaviors of the two fish, and that was filmed the first week of October. So, and the point of that is this: if you're in a lake that you know has more browns than rainbows or bigger browns than rainbows, then maybe you want to throw the hard bait. If you're in a lake that has more rainbows than browns, or conversely bigger rainbows, which is the case in a lot of the lakes that I fish in Colorado, the rainbows are bigger but the browns are in bigger numbers, throw the jig and you'll be able to focus on the rainbows, and that's really important. Another key thing about this time of year, if you really want to catch a big brown trout, and this is the time of year to do it, make no mistake, between now and the 1st of November, this is the time to do it. Fish at night. And when I say fish at night, the biggest browns are very nocturnal, and they get the least amount of fishing pressure at night, and fishing around trout waters in October can be cold at night. But there's some doozies that will substantially outweigh the fish you're used to catching in the daylight. And so, for instance, one of the lakes that I fish, let's say the browns average, I would say they realistically average somewhere between 16 and 20 inches. But when I go at night, they average somewhere between 20 and 22 or 23 inches. In other words, my average catch goes up significantly at night. And I think it just really has to do with the fact that the bigger browns are older, and they evolved to be more nocturnal, in the same way that a whitetail buck, or even a mule deer buck for that matter, will get more nocturnal the older he gets, or largemouth bass, and particularly smallmouth bass. And the other thing is bigger fish are easier to trick in the dark, so they're a little bit more confident, for one, so they'll bite better because they're under the cover of dark and they don't get preyed on as much. And then for two, they're just obviously less aware. They can't see it. And a trout is a sight feeder, make no mistake. Yes, they can feel stuff. Yes, they can smell stuff. But at the end of the day, they've got to be able to see it first. I think you don't make as big a boat shadows and things like that. They just generally don't get harassed as much at night. So particularly in lakes that get a lot of fishing pressure, like several of the lakes I'm referencing here, they definitely will bite better at night. And I'll throw out real quick, why am I not saying specifically what lakes we're talking about? Because a whole bunch of you send me hate mail every time I do. If you want to know, I will send me an email and I will tell you what lakes I'm talking about. And that's Chad@fishfulthinker.com. But I'm not going to broadcast to everybody because many of these are very small lakes that already get a ton of fishing pressure. The importance of that, though, is that we still catch a lot of big trout in them, and it's more a matter of me keeping my locals happy and not just broadcasting it to the whole world. But if you take the time to ask me, I'll tell you where we're talking about fishing. But long story short, North Park, South Park, around Laramie Plains, all over eastern Wyoming, there's a couple down in southern Colorado as well that I'm aware of, are the general areas that I'm talking about. You can do your research from there. Now, a couple things also about brown trout this time of year, specifically browns this time of year, is that I've seen a lot of scenarios where they really just want to follow everything. They follow, they just don't want to bite. In that case, then I will tend to slowly but surely make my baits bigger. And why bigger? Well, if they'll follow and they'll stay in the area, in other words, if I'm working, let's say I'm working a number 9 hit stick and I get 2 or 3 follows in a row, particularly if I pause it and that fish stays in the area for a second, I'll upsize it and I'll go straight up to a number 13 from a 9. I'll skip the number 11 altogether. Why? I want to make it a bigger threat to the fish. I want it to be more of an annoyance to the fish. I want it to be that big brother that would not leave you alone in the back seat of the car. I want it to not vacate when he rushes up on it. And so a bigger bait will often help in that scenario. Conversely, if you're getting fish that are slapping and not getting hold of a bait, they're actually hitting it but not getting hold of it, then I would back it down a little bit in size and you'll get more committed bites to it a lot of the time. So those are nuances. I wouldn't pin a ton of stock on it, but that's the general MO that I work through in terms of trying to get followers turned into bites. The rainbows, you're not going to get a lot of follows on, and if you're fishing a jig and they follow it up, you wind it up, let's say you're done with your retrieve and you go to wind it up and one of them follows it up, open the bail and drop it. And what I mean by that is literally open the bail, let the bait have total slack and let it go to the bottom. If you get that to happen a couple of times and you can't convert it to a bite, upsize your jig head. Use your lures the same size, but upsize your jig head so that while it's farther from your boat or farther from the bank, depending on which direction you're fishing, when you hop it, it moves faster. Because clearly if they're not biting it when you're working it, but they will chase it when you wind it up, they're being a little bit more excitable. So get the bait to work faster, not slower. The mindset of fish that follow for me is always make the bait faster. When fish are following, if they are basically, if they're following, you've got their attention, but you haven't given them the urgency they need. And that's really what it comes down to. And most cases, if you completely stop the bait, unless they're being territorial about it, they're going to ignore it altogether. The browns being the difference there with the territorialness. And for the record, you could almost invert this conversation in spring for rainbows, although brown are more pishkavish, meaning they eat fish more than rainbows do. So it's not quite as pronounced, but you could almost flip this around and say, well, now it's March and the rainbows are spawning and the browns are doing the predating on the eggs. But they, like I said, browns are more pishkavish in that they eat fish more. But the brown trout, when we start talking about them in the fall like this, it really comes down to the jerkbait more than anything else. In the spring, I might get away with a jig a little bit better. What other baits besides the jerkbait? That's a good question right there. For me, it can be a plain crankbait that you just wind in, with a flicker shad being a really good choice, particularly in running water for some reason. Just an even wind on a crankbait, an even fast wind, not a nice slow wind. An even fast wind will get some browns to pounce. And I tend to throw a flicker shad for that. Another one in the wind, and this can be a really good one, is a lipless crankbait on a yo-yo retrieve. So ripping it hard and then letting it fall, and ripping it hard and letting it fall. And I think that hard rip combined with all the noise that it makes, because of the BBs that are in a lipless crankbait, like a rattle trap's probably the one you guys are famous, is most famous. It's the inventor of the breed, but I also throw a lot of war pigs, which is a Berkley product. It's a little bit more, it sinks more vertically and swims better straight down, whereas a rattle trap tends to roll on one side or the other. It's an earlier iteration of the bait. The war pig sinks and stays upright better. That's the fundamental difference in the two in terms of why I choose the war pig over the rattle trap. But it's a rip and then pause. So I'm going to do it as with all of this. All of this is done on braided line for me. That's not going to come as a shocker. All of it's going to be braided line because I want to be able to make long throws and cover some water. So I've got long rods, long braided line, and we cover water with it. That's a critical thing. And the lipless crankbait, I can throw that thing a mile, and I can rip it and let it settle back, and then rip it, take up some slack and let it settle back, rip it again, take up some slack, let it settle back, and I'll guard it with the rod tip as it drops. Usually if they're on that presentation, they will hit that thing so hard that your neighbor next door will know you got a bite. They will blast that thing. I typically reserve it for windy days. The windier it is, the more I will do that, and it's because of the sheer noise that it puts off. You have a very noisy environment, and meaning that the water's stirred up, there's waves on the surface, light penetration is diluted, and that rattle will get their attention and provoke them. If it's real calm, I focus hard on the jerkbait, and that's when it a lot of times will be where that slow float up or slow sink of a jerkbait will make all the difference in the world. All that crazy jerking will get their attention, a brown will rush up on it, and then as it either floats up or sinks down, they'll go ahead and grab it. And one of the most fun days I ever had, they were grabbing a number 11 floating jerkbait, and it was coming to this, and they were getting it right when it was breaking the surface, and you could watch every one of them get it. And it literally, you jerk it like crazy, nothing would happen, you'd kill it, it'd float up, and just when it broke the surface film and left those dimples, it would just get annihilated by browns. And most of them had it like a dog with a bone right in the middle of the bait. Just very committed bites, and super fun to see that. But again, it's up to the angler to mix up the retrieves to get it there. Quick word on colors. I throw a lot of golds, a lot of chromes, and some relatively hot colors this time of year because, again, the excitability of the trout. Hot colors being oranges, reds, pinks. A lot of the time, I'll throw those colors this time of year. I will also throw just a plain white and some kind of color like that, and that will be an aggressive color as well, and the clear water that trout are in. But I don't generally throw any hyper natural colors this time of year for either one of the fish. If I'm throwing for rainbows, and I don't want this to be a whole podcast just on browns, because most of the lakes we're talking about are going to have a mix of both. The rainbows for jigs, those are going to be more natural colors in a lot of cases, although I will have a twinge of some color, an apricot or a pink or an orange, maybe in that jig, particularly if it's a marabou jig. Otherwise, if I'm throwing a tube jig, it's probably going to be a very natural, a brown or a black, something like that. And if I'm throwing a gulp minnow or something, those for me are always a standard of one of a couple, three colors, which is either smelt color, which is a very natural color and goes against what I'm telling you right here, but I throw that same color all the time, everywhere, because it's consistent. And that, just for the record, is every species. I don't care if we're talking bass, walleye, trout, or bluegills, the smelt colored gulp minnow will get you bites. And that's the same thing with the trout. And then I'll throw like paddle shads, things like that, maybe with a little bit more of a hot color. So that's something I'm going to be retrieving. The rainbow trout colors, the pinks, are really, really solid. And I want to commend the guys at Berkley, by the way, because they came out and fished with me. A couple of the guys that are key guys for Berkley for lure development came out and fished with me and saw the importance of pink as a color for trout, for rainbows and browns, but particularly rainbows, and subsequently immediately came out with a bunch of new baits in that same color range, including some of the hard baits. So That can be really important. I'll throw one more quick thing out. If you are going to throw a hard bait for rainbows this time of year, smaller tends to be better for the rainbows, whereas bigger tends to be better for the browns. So if, let's say it's a really windy condition, you can't keep track of that jig, or it's really weedy and the jig's getting down in the weeds, if you put a heavy enough weight on it that you can control it in the wind, well, then work a hard bait over the top. But I would downsize it. I would be in like a size 7 or 9 at the most, instead of a 9 on the small end and a 13 on the big end. So the rainbows, for whatever reason, and actually it's not, I guess, terribly surprising when you look at it, particularly with the hen rainbows. Their mouths aren't even as big as browns. So that should tell you a little bit, and their teeth aren't as pronounced, and that should tell you a little bit right there. So rainbows and browns, my favorite time of year to do it. I can fish very aggressively. I will tend to cover a lot of water. I want to fish where there's wind-blown areas. I want to fish riprap areas. I avoid muddy water. I will gravitate to inlets. This is a whole bunch of day one stuff. Dams and inlets are going to be very, very good for you at this time of year. We'll gravitate to those. I will avoid any weeds that are dying off, and I will definitely fish around inside weed lines, particularly if those weed lines are still green. And I prefer heavy overcast skies if at all possible. Not necessarily wind, but a heavy, low ceiling, overcast sky, for whatever reason, tends to produce the best results for me when it comes to this time of year for trout fishing. And then if you really want to catch a big one, go in the dark. There's a couple things about going in the dark. For one, I'm fishing for big fish, and that's it. So I'm going to use big baits. For one. For two, I'm not going to use a light. If there's a light flashing around, it has been my experience that will shut everything off. Now, a light that is stationary and does not move is a different story. A dock light, a natural light that occurs at a boat ramp, something like that, that's fine. But if you got a headlamp and it's shining all over the place, not so fine. And the last little tip I'll throw out, if you're talking about reservoirs, maybe you're somewhere up and down the Front Range of Colorado or whatever, and you want to fish reservoirs, go target rainbows around boat ramps. And why boat ramps? Because boat ramps is where they stock trout, and those rainbows will spend all winter somewhere near those boat ramps. A lot of the time they'll show back up there in fall. So basically they're staging, and I've caught rainbows in narrow good weather windows in January that are fully dropping eggs. They're already thinking spawn at that point. And so fishing around the boat ramps where they were originally stocked is where they will come back to, in the same way that a salmon will go to whatever stream that he was born in. And so they will congregate heavily. In my home lake, they'll congregate heavily around the two boat ramps that they stock them at. And they'll do that the same in places wherever we go. So that's another tip for you guys in the reservoirs. You really want to find them. And the closer we get to winter, the better those boat ramps will get. So bit of an odd podcast for me, kind of all over the place, but it's the time of year. I'm giddy about it. I'm packing right now to go fishing myself, and everything I just talked about is in the boat, and I'm almost talking myself through it at the same time as to how I'm going to approach the fishing. So if you guys want to join the conversation at Fishful Thinker, I'd appreciate that. Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, of course the YouTube channel as well. Please subscribe while you're there. Otherwise, tune in and catch us on Altitude Sports or World Fishing Network. Thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.